Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the thing you thought you controlled, the habit, the craving, the subtle tug of a need, has been controlling you all along. You open your eyes, but the room feels heavier than usual, like an invisible weight pressing against the walls. Something inside you whispers for relief, not in words, but in the subtle ache of longing. It's not always a substance. Sometimes it's a scrolling thumb. Sometimes it's a drink at night, a bite of food, a fleeting romance, a new purchase, a burst of applause, a hit of recognition. Whatever its shape, the need lives inside you like a silent tenant, demanding rent you didn't realize you owed. But here's the paradox that unsettles you the longer you stare at it. If addiction is about losing control, why does it feel so much like self-soothing? Why does the very thing that slowly dismantles you also feel, at least for a moment, like the only thing keeping you alive? You've been told addiction is a moral failure, a bad habit, a weakness. Yet when you look deeper, when you trace the roots back to their source, the story begins to shift. What if addiction is not the enemy, but the language of your pain? What if every craving is your nervous system crying out for safety, connection, and meaning in a world that long ago taught you to suppress your wounds? Gabor Maté once wrote that the question is never, why the addiction, but why the pain? This question, deceptively simple, tears a hole through the surface of every easy answer. Because to ask why the pain is to turn your gaze inward toward memories you've buried, toward an inheritance of stress, shame, and unspoken grief. It forces you to confront not just the behavior, but the landscape of your life. Imagine you're standing in front of a mirror, not the kind that flatters you, but the kind that reveals things. Every habit you've used to cope with Louise. Oneliness. Every escape you've crafted to survive unbearable feelings, they're all lined up behind you like ghosts. You thought you were fighting against substances or screens or patterns. But what if instead you've been fighting against an absence, against the lack of nurture, connection, and meaning that should have been there but wasn't? Why does society obsess over punishing addiction while ignoring the wounds that create it? Why do we treat the symptom but exile the root cause to silence? Why does our culture glorify productivity, individualism, and self-reliance, but recoil at the vulnerability required to heal? And why, perhaps most disturbingly, do so many people never realize they're addicted at all? Addicted to approval, to work, to status, to distractions, because their addictions are socially acceptable? You may think this doesn't apply to you, but consider this. How many times do you reach for your phone without thinking? How often do you fill your silence with noise because it's unbearable to sit with yourself? How many things in your life are not choices but compulsions wearing the mask of freedom? Every culture has its addictions. Every age invents new ways of anesthetizing its collective pain. The question is not whether you're addicted, but how, and to what, and why. And beneath that, the most radical question of all: what would happen if you stopped running? If you're honest, the idea terrifies you. Because if you put down the drink, the phone, the work, the applause, what remains? What is left of you when the anesthesia wears off? This is not just a question of behavior, it's a question of identity. Who are you without the coping strategies you've mistaken for your personality? The truth is, you don't know yet. Most people don't. And that uncertainty, the trembling at the edge of self-discovery, is where transformation begins. But transformation demands so. Things society rarely teaches: the courage to face your own pain without flinching. We live in an age of endless distraction, but also in an age of unprecedented opportunity to wake up. The very forces that exploit our wounds also make it impossible to hide from them forever. The cracks are showing. People are breaking down under the weight of silent suffering, and in that breakdown lies a strange kind of hope. This is where Gabor Maté's insight lands like a thunderclap. Addiction is not the disease. Addiction is the attempted cure. It is the story of a nervous system trying, however clumsily, to heal itself. But you cannot heal pain by numbing it. You can only heal by turning toward what hurts. And so the great question lingers in the air, waiting for you to pick it up. If addiction is the cry of your pain, what will it take for you to finally listen? Transition to next section. Because hidden beneath your cravings, your habits, and your distractions lies a deeper reality, a psychological and societal wound so pervasive that most people never see it. To understand how to heal the addicted mind, you must first uncover the forces that created it. Beneath the surface of your cravings lies a terrain you didn't choose but were born into. Before you ever picked up a glass, scrolled a screen, or chased applause, your nervous system was already learning something about the world, that safety is conditional, that love may be withdrawn, that your needs can be dangerous. This is the hidden problem. Addiction does not spring fully formed from bad choices. It germinates in the soil of unmet needs, chronic stress, and emotional disconnection. Imagine an infant. Its cries are not manipulation, not demands, but raw expressions of vulnerability. The infant's developing brain is like soft clay, sculpted by the hands of its caregivers. If those hands are attentive, warm, and consistent, the clay hardens into a form capable of trust, self-soothing, and resilience. But if the hands are absent, harsh, unpredictable, or themselves wounded, the clay cracks. It still hardens, but around those cracks are patterns of vigilance, hunger, and fear. Those early adaptations are brilliant for survival, but costly for adulthood. They whisper into the future, "You are on your own." Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of us we are forced to exile to survive. Not only our rage, our grief, and our longing, but also our vulnerability, our capacity to feel. What is suppressed does not vanish. It festers, seeking expression in indirect ways. Addiction is one such expression. It is a ritual enacted by the shadow, a way of soothing what you cannot otherwise name. Gabor Maté's work with people living with severe drug dependency revealed a pattern. Every story, however different on the surface, carried a thread of trauma, neglect, or emotional loss. Not why the addiction, he insisted, but why the pain. Yet mainstream culture remains obsessed with the addiction because pain is inconvenient to acknowledge. It implicates parents, communities, systems. It calls into question not just the individual, but the environment in which that individual became who they are. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote of the will as a blind striving, a restless hunger at the core of existence. You feel this hunger not just as desire, but as compulsion, an ache that can never be permanently satisfied. Our modern world exploits this ache with algorithmic precision. Every advertisement, every notification, every market trend is designed to capture your restlessness and redirect it into consumption. The culture becomes an accomplice to your wounds. It profits from your numbness. Aldous Huxley saw this coming. In Brave New World, citizens are pacified with soma, a drug that erases pain and dissent. In our world, soma has no single form. It's a cocktail of substances, entertainment, awan, and self-curated images. The result is the same, a society of people who believe they're free while unconsciously medicating their despair. We punish the heroin user while praising the workaholic. We condemn the alcoholic, but idolize the social media addict who monetizes attention. Different substances, same function, a flight from unbearable experience. But the roots of addiction are not only individual or cultural, they are existential. Jean-Paul Sartre described human existence as condemned to be free, thrust into a world without inherent meaning, forced to create our own. That freedom is terrifying. It carries with it an undercurrent of dread, a sense of groundlessness. Addiction offers a counterfeit ground. It gives you something to do, something to crave, something to structure your day around, a rhythm to your suffering. In the moment of use, the dread recedes. Here lies the paradox. The very act meant to relieve your pain deepens it. Each escape reinforces the wound it tries to soothe. And yet, as Viktor Frankl observed, suffering without meaning becomes unbearable. What people seek in addiction is not just relief, but a sense of aliveness, a brief taste of meaning in an otherwise disconnected life. You can see this if you step back from substances and look at behavior. The person who works 80 hours a week, who can't stop checking email at midnight, who compulsively seeks validation online, these are not caricatures of addicts. They are expressions of the same wound, hidden under a veneer of normality. In fact, society rewards certain addictions precisely because they fuel productivity, consumption, and control. This hidden problem is not simply addiction, but alienation. Alienation from your own body, your emotions, your community, your history. A culture built on speed, competition, and distraction leaves little room for the slow, painful work of healing. As long as you stay busy numbing yourself, you don't have to confront the emptiness underneath. And as long as the emptiness stays hidden, the system can continue as it is. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot outsource your healing. You cannot expect a culture that profits from your pain to teach you how to face it. Healing begins with awareness, a kind of inner rebellion against the narratives you were given. It begins with questioning the story that your cravings are your fault, or that if you just had more willpower, you'd be free. Jung warned that what you do not make conscious will manifest as fate. If you do not confront your pain, it will continue to express itself in compulsions, symptoms, and self-sabotage. This is not a moral condemnation, but a psychological law. The nervous system does not care about your image, it cares about survival. And when survival has meant numbing, numbing will continue until something interrupts it. You're approaching the edge of that interruption now, by looking at addiction not as a personal failing, but as a signal, a flare from the depths of your own psyche. You begin to reclaim agency. The flare points not just to the problem, but to the path. Yet understanding the roots is only half the battle. To grasp how urgent and pervasive this problem truly is, you have to see its consequences, not just in the lives of individuals, but woven through the fabric of society itself. That is where the next step takes us. Transition to next section. What happens when millions live out this pattern simultaneously? When entire communities anesthetize their wounds in synchronized ways? The unseen consequences ripple far beyond the individual, and only by facing them can you begin to imagine freedom. Stand back far enough and the pattern stops looking like isolated suffering and starts looking like a civilization-wide trance. Millions reaching for their phones upon waking, millions numbing with alcohol at night, millions driven by workaholism, perfectionism, shopping, gambling, porn, sugar, scrolling, self-curated personas. Different forms, same function. The anesthesia has become ambient. What you thought was your private struggle is actually the default state of an entire culture. When this many people are anesthetized at once, reality itself bends. Families become places of silent detachment, communities fracture, institutions meant to nurture become engines of competition. Politics devolves into outrage theater because outrage is the one feeling still allowed to pierce the numbness. The addicted mind does not only live in individuals, it shapes systems. An addicted culture demands instant gratification, demands perpetual novelty, and punishes patience, reflection, and depth. This is the hidden cost no one names. Every compulsive click, every binge, every surge of dopamine reinforces neural pathways of avoidance. Over time, whole populations become less able to tolerate discomfort, ambiguity, or genuine intimacy. Children learn from distracted parents not how to regulate emotions, but how to flee them. Lovers mistake intensity for connection. Workers mistake busyness for purpose. Citizens mistake consumption for freedom. Neurology explains part of this. Repeated surges of dopamine without corresponding fulfillment erode the brain's capacity for pleasure, leaving a baseline of dissatisfaction. Like a speaker turned up too high for too long, the system distorts. You need more to feel less. This is not a moral defect, but a physiological loop, and at scale it produces a society of restless, easily manipulated minds, primed for advertising, demagoguery, and distraction. Psychologically, the consequences are even more subtle. Gabor Maté writes about how early stress shapes the developing brain, especially the systems that regulate attention, emotion, and impulse control. When an entire society is stressed by inequality, speed, insecurity, the conditions for addictive patterns multiply. Trauma is no longer an individual event, but a collective atmosphere. In such an atmosphere, addiction is not an anomaly, it is an adaptation. Think of the shadow gate. Again, not in one person, but in a whole civilization. What is exiled returns disguised. Repressed grief becomes consumer frenzy. Unacknowledged loneliness becomes hyperconnectivity. Disowned vulnerability becomes aggression and polarization. The same dynamic Jung described in the psyche plays out at the cultural level. What we will not face consciously, we enact unconsciously. And because these consequences are hidden in plain sight, they're hard to resist. The social media feed feels normal. The drink after work feels deserved. The 90-hour workweek feels ambitious. The numbness feels like life. Meanwhile, deeper capacities, patience, empathy, creativity, authentic joy, atrophy from disuse. A society addicted to numbing cannot raise children who know how to feel, cannot elect leaders who know how to reflect, cannot produce art that knows how to heal. This is why the problem is urgent. It's not only about individual freedom from substances or habits. It's about whether you and we retain the ability to feel reality as it is. Without that, every choice you make is distorted. Without that, democracy becomes a spectacle, relationships become transactions, inner life becomes an algorithmic feed. Without that, meaning shrinks to whatever offers the next hit. You can see the unseen consequences in the language people use. Burnout instead of grief, stress instead of despair, busy instead of lonely. Euphemisms to keep pain at arm's length, yet the body keeps the score. Anxiety disorders rise, depression deepens, loneliness spreads, suicide becomes epidemic, and still the culture says more productivity, more content, more stimulation, like a doctor prescribing higher doses of the very drug that caused the illness. There's another consequence too, shame. Because addiction in all its forms is still framed as weakness, people hide their struggles. Shame isolates them further, cutting them off from the very connection that could heal. The result is a feedback loop of secrecy, self-hatred, and escalation. This isn't only the story of the heroin user under a bridge. It's the executive with a hidden drinking problem, the influencer crying after the live stream ends, the parent scrolling at 2 a.m. because silence feels unbearable. If you pause here, you can feel the tension building. The problem is not small. It is not confined to them. It is woven into you, into me, into the architecture of modern life. Seeing it clearly can feel overwhelming. But it's also the beginning of freedom. Because what you can name, you can question. And what you can question, you can change. Still, awareness alone is not enough. You cannot simply will yourself out of a system designed to keep you numb. Breaking free requires more than abstinence or self-discipline. It requires a radical reorientation, a willingness to face what you've been avoiding and to reclaim the parts of yourself you've exiled. It is an act of rebellion, not against pleasure, but against unconsciousness. This is the threshold where many turn back. The anesthesia, for all its costs, is familiar. The rawness beneath it is not. To walk away from your numbing rituals is to walk into your pain, your memories, your emptiness. It feels like death at first. Yet hidden inside that descent is the possibility of rebirth. The question becomes, are you willing? Are you willing to stop running, to stop blaming, to stop numbing long enough to feel what is actually there? Are you willing to confront not just the addiction, but the pain beneath it, the loneliness beneath the pain, the humanity beneath the loneliness? This is where the rebellion begins. Not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet, conscious acts of turning toward yourself. Not in self-condemnation, but in self-understanding. Not in moralizing, but in compassion. Because the addicted mind is not an enemy to be conquered, but a wounded part of you asking to be heard. Transition to next section. How do you do that? How do you rebel against an entire inner and outer system designed to keep you numb? The next step is not about punishment, but about power, a new kind of power born from facing what you've fled. The real rebellion does not begin with shouting or smashing. It begins in silence, an act of radical refusal to keep numbing. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind you lies the familiar terrain of your habits, the safe anesthesia you've built around your wounds. Before you lies the uncharted territory of feeling, presence, and vulnerability. Stepping forward feels like jumping, yet this is the only way out. Breaking free is not about force, it is about honesty. Gabor Maté emphasizes that healing addiction is not a moral project, but an act of self-compassion. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened to me?" That shift may sound small, but it cracks the entire frame. Instead of seeing yourself as broken, you see your patterns as intelligent responses to pain. The question then becomes, how can I meet my pain with what it actually needs? To rebel against addiction is to rebel against isolation. No one heals in a vacuum. The nervous system that was wounded in relationship must be healed in relationship. This may mean therapy, support groups, friendships rooted in honesty rather than performance, spiritual communities that honor vulnerability rather than shame it. You cannot outsource this work, but you cannot do it alone either. Connection is not a luxury, it is medicine. It is also to rebel against speed. Addictive culture thrives on immediacy, instant hits, instant results, instant distractions. Healing happens slowly. It involves sitting with urges instead of acting on them, feeling emotions instead of fleeing them, tolerating emptiness until it reveals what lies beneath. This slowness is its own kind of protest in a world that monetizes your attention span. Carl Jung described individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, as a descent, a confrontation with the parts of yourself you've disowned. In practical terms, this means making space to feel what you've been avoiding. Meditation, journaling, trauma-informed therapy, somatic practices. These are not trendy wellness hacks, but ways of listening to the body's story. When you stop numbing, the first thing you hear is pain. If you can stay, the next thing you hear is truth. This rebellion also requires examining the stories you live inside. Addiction is sustained by shame and by the belief that you must be someone other than who you are to be loved. Breaking free means telling a new story, not a fantasy of invulnerability, but a reality of wholeness. You are not your cravings. You are not your worst day. You are not even your coping mechanisms. They are chapters in a larger book, not the title of the book itself. Counterintuitively, the path forward involves making friends with your craving. Instead of treating it as an enemy, you treat it as a messenger. Each urge becomes a signal. Something inside me needs attention. You pause, breathe, and ask, what is this really about? Sometimes the answer is obvious: loneliness, stress, boredom. Sometimes it is old pain surfacing. Either way, by turning toward it rather than away, you begin to unwind the loop. Rebellion also happens in the body. Addictive behavior dysregulates the nervous system. Healing re-regulates it. Practices like breathwork, mindful movement, time in nature, and even simple acts of grounding, pressing your feet into the floor, naming what you see around you, help restore a sense of safety. Safety is not an abstraction. It is a felt experience. Without it, no amount of insight can hold. With it, even the deepest wounds begin to soften. On a larger scale, to break free is to question the culture's values. If productivity, status, and distraction are the currencies of your environment, choosing presence, rest, and the authenticity is an act of defiance. You stop chasing every notification, you stop glamorizing burnout, you stop believing that busyness equals worth. This will make you stand out. It may even cost you relationships, jobs, or identities built around the old patterns, but what you lose in false belonging, you gain in genuine selfhood. You also begin to explore meaning. Viktor Frankl, writing from a concentration camp, observed that those who survived the worst conditions were not the physically strongest, but those who could find meaning in their suffering. Meaning does not erase pain, but it transforms it from chaos into story, from random cruelty into catalyst. When you discover what your pain has been asking of you, what value or purpose lies hidden within it, you stop running from it and start walking with it. All of this sounds heroic, but in practice, it is ordinary. It's saying no to the drink and yes to the walk. It's staying with your breath for 30 seconds instead of reaching for your phone. It's telling a friend the truth about what you're going through. It's making one small, unglamorous choice after another until the pattern shifts. These are quiet rebellions. But every quiet rebellion weakens the hold of the old system and strengthens the muscle of freedom. Gabor Maté calls this process compassionate inquiry, looking at your behavior without judgment to see what it's trying to protect. This is the opposite of willpower. Willpower fights, compassion listens, And listening allows something new to emerge, something stronger than compulsion, self-trust. As this trust grows, the cravings lose their power, not because they disappear overnight, but because they no longer define you. You can feel them without acting on them. You can choose. This is freedom at its simplest, not the absence of desire, but the presence of choice. Transition to next section. And yet, even this is not the end. Beyond breaking free lies something deeper, a final realization that reframes everything you've endured. This is not just about stopping addiction, but about discovering who you are when the anesthesia is gone. The last step is the most profound. The final, most powerful realization. There comes a moment, after the cravings have been named and the old stories questioned, when you find yourself sitting in the quiet. No phone in your hand, no numbing ritual underway, no mask on your face. Just you, breathing. At first it feels like absence, like loss. The anesthesia is gone and what remains is a raw stillness. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to reach for the next distraction, you begin to notice something unexpected. The stillness is alive. This is the place you've been running from, your own being. Beneath the pain, beneath the trauma, beneath the craving is not a void, but a presence. It was never destroyed, only obscured. All the substances, all the compulsions, all the frantic striving were not proof of your brokenness, but proof of your longing for this very presence. This is what the addicted mind has been trying to return to all along, a sense of safety, connection, and aliveness that does not depend on the next hit. Gabor Maté calls this authentic selfhood, the state in which you are no longer at war with your experience. Carl Jung described it as individuation, the integration of your conscious self with your shadow, a reunification of what was split. Viktor Frankl called it meaning, the power to transform suffering into purpose. Different names, same reality, a homecoming to yourself. The ultimate truth is paradoxical. Addiction feels like the loss of control, yet it is built on the attempt to control unbearable feelings. Healing feels like surrender, yet it reveals the only real freedom you have. You cannot eradicate your wounds or erase your past. You cannot guarantee that cravings will never arise again, but you can leer, and to meet them from a place of wholeness rather than exile. In doing so, the compulsion weakens because its fuel, self-rejection, is gone. From this place, even pain changes texture. It stops being an enemy and becomes information. Grief shows you what you loved. Anger shows you what you value. Loneliness shows you where you've been disconnected. Instead of anesthetizing these messengers, you can listen. Each feeling becomes a guide back to what is essential. This is also the point where you begin to see addiction differently, not as a moral failure, but as an evolutionary misfire, a nervous system trying to heal in the only way it knows. You start to feel compassion for the part of you that reached for the drink, the screen, the work, the applause. It was not trying to destroy you, it was trying to protect you. Compassion does not excuse harm, but it dissolves shame. And shame is the glue that holds addiction in place. When shame dissolves, responsibility becomes possible, not the punitive kind, but the creative kind. You stop asking, how do I get rid of this craving, and start asking, what life do I want to build now that I am no longer hiding from myself? This is not an escape from the world, but an entry into it. You re-enter relationships not as a half-person seeking anesthesia, but as a whole person seeking connection. You re-enter work not as a compulsion, but as a contribution. You re-enter solitude not as a punishment, but as a practice. You also begin to sense a deeper freedom than choice, the freedom to be. Before, your life was a series of reactions. Avoid this, chase that. Now it can become a series of responses rooted in awareness. You can choose to stay present even in discomfort. You can choose to act from values rather than impulses. This is not a static state, but an ongoing practice, a kind of spiritual musculature that strengthens each time you return to yourself. Look around, and the world will still be addicted. It will still tempt you with distractions, still monetize your Attention still sell you anesthesia in new forms, but you will no longer be a passive consumer of your own numbness. You will know the difference between pleasure and relief, between connection and escape. You will have learned how to feel reality without running from it. The final realization is that healing the addicted mind is not about becoming a different person. It is about becoming fully yourself. The self you exile to survive is the self you now welcome back. The wound becomes a doorway. What once felt like a curse becomes a teacher. And through this, your life stops being only about you. As you heal, you become a source of presence for others still trapped in the anesthesia. Your very being becomes an invitation. It is possible to live awake. Poetically speaking, this is the moment when the prisoner discovers the cell was never locked. The bars were beliefs, the guard was shame, the escape route was turning inward. The key was always in your hand, but you had to stop numbing long enough to feel it. This is the ultimate truth Gabor Maté points toward. Addiction is not the enemy. Disconnection is. And the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. Connection to your body, your feelings, your purpose, your community, your life. When you live from this connection, the mind that once felt addicted can finally rest. So here you sit in the quiet, breathing. You feel the echo of your old habits still tugging at you, but you also feel something stronger, the pulse of your own aliveness. This is not the end of your journey, but the beginning of living it consciously. The anesthesia is gone. The pain is real, and so is the possibility. What you do next is not a program or a checklist, but a way of being, staying awake to yourself, listening to your pain as a messenger, choosing connection over escape, meaning over numbness, presence over anesthesia. Each time you do, you rebel again. Each time you do, you return home. Closing image. Imagine walking out of a darkened room into morning light. The air is cool, the sky vast. Nothing external has changed. The city still hums, the world still churns, but you take a breath, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like yours.